Good morning, friends. It has been so long since I have been together with people in a big crowd in the middle of the city that honestly, the scene from Athens and our reading from the book of Acts this morning feels really far away. In case you don't know much about first century Athens, it would probably be a reasonably familiar place to you. Albeit with more columns and statues than a city like Houston, it was still hot and humid and crowded. It was a busy port city. And in Athens, amid all of the people going about their days, there were often people making speeches and having debates about the issues of the day. So instead of those happening on Twitter, they happened in real life, out on the streets. There would be people preaching and teaching all kinds of new ideas. Now, nowadays, back when we were allowed to go outside and be in crowds, when a street preacher showed up, people generally didn't listen. But back then, people did, at least sometimes, and engaged in vigorous debates with them. And that's exactly what happens in our story today, because among all of those people was Paul giving a sermon about the resurrection of Jesus. So while street preachers were not uncommon at the time, Paul's message was. He's talking about a God who died and rose from the dead and who is right with us all the time. And this was very different than the standard philosophy of the day. And so when they heard him, a group of some of the philosophers took him out of the marketplace and up to the Areopagus, which in Athens is a high place near the Acropolis where the intellectual elite of the time could debate without being hindered by all of the big crowds. And so they grab him and they take him up there. And as soon as they get him up on the hill, Paul begins to preach again. And he preaches the text we just read this morning. Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. I assume he's trying to butter them up here. He says, "For as I went about the city, I looked carefully at the objects of your worship, and I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" Paul has seen that the Athenians have given themselves to deities that are made of gold and silver and stone, items that are formed by human hands and offered to every conceivable thing. Wisdom, beauty, basic needs. They had a God with a statue to cover all of it, to make sure that anything they needed would be taken care of by whichever God took care of that. And so in what may be a really pitiable turn of events, just to make sure all their bases are covered, they've made this statue to an unknown God. Just in case they miss something with the other gods, they want to make sure they're taken care of. It's kind of a strange story for us, but first century Athens could look very familiar if we look closely. Filled with idols of all kinds and full of trust in things that aren't God. And when we think of the idols of our time, we frequently turn to the usual suspects, right? Money, power, desire, social status. And those are certainly idols for us, although right now we're seeing how flimsy and fragile those things might be. But there are even more subtle and even more seductive idols for us. And they look a little more like this altar to an unknown God than to something made of silver or gold. You see, because it's hard for us to know God, we end up creating these ideas about how we believe God ought to act in the world, usually based on what we would do if we were God and then blown up really big. But we do this, we decide how God ought to act, and then we miss how God is actually moving among us. The temptation to conform God to our ideas and our plans is the sneakiest of all idols, because it hides in things that seem really good, in practical planning and in sensible organization and in small claims of control and efforts to set up our lives in ways that we can manage, rather than claiming the endless possibilities that God has for us. So we set up a life the way that we like, and then we ask God to bless what's there. instead of opening ourselves up to where a living God would lead us. Typically, the lives we build have all kinds of fallbacks and safety nets and just in case things, sort of like an idol to what we're not quite sure. But lots of just in case things, and making plans and being organized and prepared are not bad things in and of themselves. If anything, I wish I'd been a bit more prepared for the current disaster that we're in. But when our plans and preparations have become so structured and so inflexible that we fear anything that is new or different, they become an idol, standing in opposition of the God of new life. Our careful and meticulous decision-making about where we'll live and where we'll work and how we will or will not serve God give us a false sense of control. And that control isolates us, especially from our brothers and sisters in Christ who might mess with our well-constructed lives by calling us to respond to their suffering or share in their joy. This reality is playing out boldly in pandemic days, as the equality and injustice we've built into our systems has been laid bare in the way that this disease and its economic fallout have played out. We've made an idol of the world as it is, and traded that for the world that God made for us. A world of justice and peace where we live together as brothers and sisters. So our idols may not always be made of silver and gold like in Athens, but we still have them, in part because we need something we can touch or taste or feel. We need something we can rely on. And generally, when faced with trusting God or relying on the work of our own hands, we'll rely on what we can see and feel and get for ourselves. And so in the picture that we get of Athens, it would seem there are idols everywhere, but that God is still unknown. In our time, it's a little different, though we are still surrounded by symbols of our own reliance on ourselves and on the systems that we've built. We rely on our work, our buildings, our meticulously set up protections from the unexpected, many of which have been stripped from us in recent days. That's part of why the job losses so many of us are experiencing right now are so devastating, and why it's harder to be in worship when we can't be inside our church, because those things give us a sense of safety and identity, in addition to providing a livelihood or a sense of peace. And because they give us that sense of safety and identity, which are good things, it makes it easy for us to believe that those are the things that will protect us and give us life and allow us to know God. But the gospel tells us over and over again that our God is a living God and one who is often on the move and doing things in new ways. The Psalms describe idols like the ones in Athens as gods with no power or purpose. Psalm 115 says that they have mouths but do not speak, and eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, and noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. It says that those who make them are like them, and so are those who trust in them. When we have given ourselves to idols that we make, we become like them, having no power or purpose. We lose the ability to see the work of God in our lives, the ability to know the presence and power and love of the living God, and sometimes our ability to connect with the brothers and sisters God has given us. And that's the difference that Paul is trying to illustrate. You can have this living God or a bunch of lifeless things that don't really do what we hoped they would do for us. And our God, this living God that Paul is trying to tell them about, has actually been revealed to us not in statues, but in Jesus. Jesus has come, God incarnate, or as Ben so ably told us in last week's children's time, God bonded with human skin, the incarnation, God come to be with us. which is amazing on its own, but then the part of the story that so intrigues the Athenians, that Jesus came in the flesh and then died and then rose again. So we don't just follow in the life and death of Jesus, but we also follow in his resurrection, and we cling to his promise of new life. And if we cling to this promise, the promise of new life that nothing else can give us, we come to know what the letter to Timothy calls the part of life that is real life. You see, in most of our grabs for a sense of control, are we not looking for the very thing that Jesus has offered freely to us? For a life that has power and purpose, that does good in the world, that gives us a community of grace to journey with? That's the part of life that is real life. Some of the hardest things about right now for us are some of the very things that the Athenians were struggling with too. There's too much we can't control. There's too much that is unknown to us. And so, of course, we are frantically trying to get past it and get back to normal. Now, experts tell us that when it comes to a pandemic, back to normal is the wrong approach. And I wonder if it's the wrong approach to a life of faith. Maybe back to normal isn't all it's cracked up to be. And Jesus reminds us in this season of resurrection to follow him, not back to an old life, but to a new life altogether. So perhaps this is a time not to grasp tighter to the idols that we've built for ourselves, but to let go, to be willing to humbly embrace that we don't know all we would like. And so we live by faith and plunge ourselves into the waters of God's grace, trusting that they'll hold us. This is not an easy way to live, but it is worth it. And it is so because of what Paul says so clearly to the folks in Athens, that the God in whom we all live and move and have our being is not far from us. That God is with us, whether we are in our sanctuary or in front of our computer screens, is with us through actual fires and floods, is not far from us when we are grasping for something to hold on to, when the world feels uncertain and frightening and like we don't know all that we should. God is nearer than our own breath, even in the moment when we let go and step toward new life. The one in whom we live and move and have our being is not far from each one of us. Thanks be to God. Amen.